Hello, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me and see me well. It is truly a pleasure to be here. I'm going to share some slides if you want to put them on, CMU.
Give us a sec. We're pulling them up.
Sure, no problem. While the slides are coming up, so my talk today is going to be about the future of mobility and specifically addressing what's going on with cities, transportation, and innovation. And what we just heard about throughout the last couple hours is, of course, first of all, the imperative around energy and climate, which is definitely something we'll be talking about, but also the social justice that's necessary in energy. And I think it was touched upon briefly also around transportation is just so important. So we'll be talking about that too. This is a climate change, and the impact of it is near and dear to me. In 2006, it really dawned upon me that we do have a significant problem. And I was set about, as a VC, trying to find investments to make a difference. And I looked at the transportation sector as one of the largest sources of emissions and thought this could be done in a different way. And I applied what I learned from Silicon Valley, which is the power of marketplaces and matching supply and demand, and realizing that most vehicles are moving in a solo with just one person in them. Could we share the ride and reduce the number of vehicles and reduce emissions? So that was the genesis of getting involved and looking at the transportation sector and then investing in Lyft as the first investor. Fast forward to 2016 later, after I did some more entrepreneurial activity, I decided to join Lyft to help really move that vision forward. So my job at Lyft has been around taking us from roughly 2 million drivers that are driving their personal cars to a future where we have a shared electric self-driving fleet. And I'll be touching upon that a bit more. So let me set the stage, first of all, if you want to go to the next slide. What's the challenge we face? I think we all know that urbanization is taking off, and cities are facing a major crisis. There's 2.5 billion people over the next decade or 15 years that are going to be moving into cities around the world. 2/3 of that population will be in cities. And I think that even though the pandemic may question that, will people want to live further away from each other, we're seeing post-pandemic recovery in certain cities around the world where they're going back to normal activity, and the benefits of being in a city outweigh some of the issues that are there. So we anticipate that cities are going to continue to grow. And if you go to the next slide, moving around in a city is a challenge, and it has its issues with it. So first of all, as I mentioned, the vast majority of US commuters are driving to work alone, which means that we have roads that are clogged. So there's a lot of congestion. It's taking more time to get to where you need to go. But in addition to that, it's a safety consideration. The number of people that have died from vehicle accidents, and even more so that have died from vehicle emissions, so diseases related that spring from emissions, is even larger. And of course, we're utilizing a lot of important space that we have in our nation's most expensive cities, like Los Angeles, where 14% of it is now parking. And so what needs to happen is something different. We need a better way, because if you add more roads to a city, it doesn't solve the transportation problem, especially with 2.5 billion people moving in. So if you go to the next slide, I'll use a third-party expert here. McKinsey and Bloomberg's group, which was the 40 mayors from around the world, came together and commissioned a study and said, how can we revamp transportation in cities? And what they realized after their study is that they need to touch on these 5 factors, any solution that's going to be the future of transportation that's there. And so affordability, that's important also for transportation equity and for people that need it the most. And we know that demand for alternatives is very elastic depending on what the price is. Availability, they need to be able to get it 24/7. And the wait time has to be low. It has to be on demand, is what we've learned in the ride sharing space. Convenience, so that there's a short walk or a no walk, especially in a city, because you have that density. And efficiency that's there. So to lower the number of vehicles, to lower congestion of any type, even if it's non-passenger vehicles. And then, of course, sustainability with emissions and the general use of resources that are depleting. So if you go to the next slide, so how do we solve this problem? What's interesting is that the commission came back with seamless mobility being the solution to this problem. And I'll tell a little bit about some of the factors that they found and some of the effects. But one way to think about this is what we've actually started doing at Lyft. So I'm just giving Lyft as an example. I'm not trying to pitch Lyft in particular, but this is our view on seamless mobility. If you go to the next slide, what it is about moving transportation from being primarily automobile-based, and most cities were created around the automobile, and moving it to a multimodal seamless environment that incorporates, of course, technology on your phone. And the way we think about this is it's about moving it to transportation as a service rather than owned transportation. And this is very similar to what we're seeing with what happened in music, where you're no longer buying CDs, but you're accessing a vast collection that's there. Same thing with video entertainment and all the streaming video services like Netflix that are there. We think that the future is around a multimodal system where, depending on the cost-time trade-off, you'll decide how you want to move around the city. So it could be ride sharing as we know it today. It could be bike sharing, and Lyft happens to own the largest bike sharing in the country, the city bike program in New York and in Chicago and San Francisco and LA. And it also incorporates an important element which shouldn't be overlooked, which is public transit. It's still a very efficient way and a very cheap way to move lots of people from point A to point B. And of course, new vehicles such as scooters and longer term options. If you wanted to get away from the weekend from the city, you would need to have a rental, or if you have a lot of personal items that you want to maintain in that vehicle. So this, we believe, is the future. And there are many different ways to do this. This is just our way of having a subscription called Lyft Pink, so you can subscribe to transportation. So what's the impact on this? Go to the next slide. So from their study, they found that depending on the city, you could improve all those 5 factors that I talked about at the same time. So roughly accommodating 30% more traffic, cutting travel time, so congestion, lower cost, and increasing the number of point-to-point trips, which is more convenient, with lower emissions. So you can bring all of that together and you can move all of these elements forward if we can move away from the inefficiency of car ownership. One interesting statistic is that the average person that owns a vehicle only uses it about 4% of the time. So 96% of the time, that expensive asset is sitting idle. That's there. So I'll talk a little bit about where we are today and the future, but the next slide, what's important is to realize those goals is that we also have to change our core business of rideshare. We need to move that to what I've been working on, which is an electric, self-driving, and shared future. Electric for emissions, it's also cheaper, which I'll get into. Self-driving, safety-wise, cost-wise, and shared so we can reduce the number of vehicles. All 3 of those are important for the future. We just can't have one standalone. This is an example of a self-driving vehicle that has been recently tested in San Francisco, rethinking the car for urban mobility into a self-driving vehicle by a company called Zoox, which has been purchased by Amazon. So let's move to the next slide. So where are we today on this future of transportation? Well, let's go to the next slide. We're seeing some good early results from transportation as a service. First of all, we noticed that roughly almost half of Lyft riders are taking public transit at least once a week. So they're doing a multimodal transportation in their daily habits as it is. We have bikes and scooters live in significant amount of markets. And of course, we've hit critical mass. Altogether, I think we've done over 2.5 billion rides between rideshare and biking and scooters and everything combined that's there. And what's really interesting to know is that a significant portion of Lyft rides are ending or starting in what we call transportation deserts, underserved communities that aren't really served well by the existing transportation system and that are going through a lot of challenges with the pandemic, where there's safety issues about getting into a shared vehicle. So let's go to the next slide. On electric, we stated this a few months ago that our goal is to move to 100% electric vehicle by 2030. And this is not just vehicles that we would own or operate that are electric and self-driving, but also how can we do this for vehicles that drivers own? We think drivers will be around for a long time in doing that. So a key to that, if you go to the next slide, is around battery technology. And we think all the trends are going in the right direction here. What we care about most when it comes to battery technology is around price. And it's usually looking at price per unit energy density. And we're looking at longevity. So how many times can you cycle that battery? Because unlike a passenger car, where it's only being utilized 4% of the time, we can utilize our vehicles 80% of the time. So they're going to be used a lot more. Charging time makes a big difference because we need to have productive miles on the road. And charging locations is interesting. We don't have the same charging issue that most consumers are worried about, which is, are they going to find a charger where they need to go? Because we have a lot of data on where ride-sharing vehicles go in a city, and we can actually place chargers for our network where they need to be to reduce some of that charger anxiety. And as I mentioned on price, you can see the drop that's been tremendous, almost like the drop in Silicon Valley with battery technology. And we expect that to continue and getting very competitive with gas in the near future. In the short run, we do have a larger upfront cost, which is the challenge of consumers buying electric vehicles in doing that. So talk about what else is going on right now. The next slide is that self-driving is actually here now. And it's launching first in a ride-sharing network. So why is that? It's because these vehicles are still relatively brittle. They can do certain routes under certain conditions. And so what we're able to do is just deploy a self-driving vehicle when it's the right condition and it's safe to do so. And if you want to ride and there isn't one, you'll still get a Lyft driver to come get you. And you still keep that 3-minute wait time, which is what our goal is for the consumer. So you go to the next slide. Why is that happening? It's because we think that there will be, just like you think about from a mobile network perspective, where there's 3G or 4G increased connectivity, your phone has to work on both networks. Same thing with the transportation network. Today, it's primarily humans with some self-driving just starting. And in the future, even a decade from now, we think that it'll still be a combination of self-driving and humans, where humans can go where self-driving technology is not ready. And in some cases, humans may prefer it, or there may be need for humans in terms of accessibility, healthcare rides, where you need to help someone getting into a vehicle, as an example, and monitor them with a human in the car. So we go to the next slide. Where are we launched in self-driving rides? So today you can go to Las Vegas, and a partner of ours called Aptiv, which is now called Motional, is there. We've done over 100,000 self-driving rides in the city of Las Vegas. And the most advanced vehicle is located in Chandler, Arizona, which is a suburb of Phoenix. And there it's operated by a company that is out of Google called Waymo. And they have started operating fully driverless rides, so no safety driver. And I experienced it myself, and it was quite amazing to go from point A to point B with everything happening in an autonomous environment and in the public. So I think it's happening slowly, but it's definitely coming. And Carnegie Mellon has been a big proponent and a real inventor of a lot of this technology. So let's talk a little bit about the future. In the next slide. And the next one. Not only will we have electric self-driving vehicles, but we think this is an opportunity for the industry at large to reinvent what it's meant to be a vehicle. We don't need to design a vehicle around a driver anymore. We can have this hybrid design, which is shown here, where when you're in autonomous mode, sometimes maybe you're not in autonomous mode, you can go and do work, or you can address to whatever you need to. So the design of the vehicle is going to be centric around the passenger. If you go to the next slide, here's some other ideas of what the future could look like. There's no reason that you have to waste your time in a vehicle and think of transportation as wasted time. There will be things like a cabin that is optimized for sleeping, for socializing. The concept of a store coming to you rather than you having to go to a store, a mobile convenience store. And of course, having the party be mobile as well, rather than it being stationary. It goes even into work as well. So let's go to the next slide. Why does your office have to be stationary? Why can't your office be mobile so that you can go wherever it inspires you the most, or to allow easy collaboration with other humans, which we believe is going to be even more important coming out of this pandemic, the value of human connection that's going to be there. So that the opportunities with mobility and autonomous mobility really open up quite a bit. The next slide talks about some ideas around transit. And here's one example of something that's in development. This is being operated in a test in Heathrow right now, which is this concept of having self-driving pods. So you get all of the benefits of the throughput that a high-speed multi-passenger train has, but you get the point-to-point benefit of pods that can autonomously move out and do point-to-point as well. And with a very personalized, safe environment of 1 to 2 passengers in a pod. So that's one example of how you could see transit being influenced by these technologies, and of course, running on an electric drivetrain. The next slide talks about how electric and autonomy is also going to revamp a lot of the B2B transportation space. Trucks, even though you think that could happen soon, it's a little bit of a challenge more because you have a truck operating at 65, 70 miles per hour, where if the mistake is made, it could be much more difficult than if it's happening in a city where you're operating at 20 miles an hour. So that's, but it's just a different set of challenges. Of course, another one below it is the warehouse. That is where the shelves are moving rather than you moving to get the shelves. And of course, air delivery using drones, looking at electric boats, looking at trains, and how do you solve the last mile of delivery with small robots that could be there instead of delivery personnel. Go to the next slide. And this goes a little bit more out in the future where we are seeing some early prototypes of bringing transportation underground to reduce congestion and increase speed, or taking it above ground. And to spend the next slide a little bit on my view around air taxis, which is an exciting area. There's over a dozen companies that have been funded. 2 of them are shown here, Lilium and Joby, which have raised a lot of money. And both of them think that they'll be up in the sky, at least in a test flight scenario in a couple of years with actual humans. There's a lot of challenges that are there around managing airspace when you're going at these low levels in a city. Noise, even though it's electric, these rotors do make noise. How do you get the zoning for takeoff and landing? And there's some technical challenges. It's all doable overall, but there's always a trade-off between range and weight. And when you put these things into production scale, are there issues or not? And of course, getting the consumer over. But we do believe that in the next decade, you'll start to see air taxis also become a reality, electric air taxis, which will have a positive effect on emissions. So the next slide is, what are the other second order effects that happen through this transportation future? It's when you think about the rippling effects, they're massive. Just the whole auto insurance business, which is huge, $190 billion. Auto loans, used cars, rentals. If you add up all of the ancillary effects just from transportation, go to the next slide, it's over $2 trillion of additional impact. And that's in addition to the transportation itself that's there. And we start rethinking a lot of what our neighborhoods look like. So go to our next slide. A lot of institutions and retail businesses that we have are going to have to be reimagined. What happens to AAA? What happens to traffic school if no one's driving? Auto service, if no one owns a car and they're all owned by the network. Of course, gas stations, when you have fleet charging that's being done by fleet owners like a Lyft or an Uber or someone else. If you go to the next slide, some unexpected scenarios, things like organ donation. We relied on accidents, unfortunately, to provide organ donations. What happens when you have a shortage? Well, good thing that universities like Carnegie Mellon and others are looking at synthetic organs because we'll need them soon with the future of transportation. And finally, you look at the next slide is around identity. We have a big form of identity in the United States is our driver's license. A lot of people don't have passports or other forms of identity. So we're going to have to rethink that when people aren't getting their driver's license anymore. So lots of change that's going on. The next slide. Finally, I'll just say there is a lot of change. The products are exciting. But as our founders put it at Lyft, what's even more exciting is the impact that a world where you can imagine pedestrians, bikers, children from all walks of life can navigate a city just as quickly and safely as it was built when it was for an automobile. So it's transforming our cities that they're built around people, not around cars. That is what I think really the future is ultimately about. So with that, I will take any questions. Thank you.
So Raj, we have a couple of questions coming in. I'm actually going to start with another CMU alum who has sent in a question. Rahul Wallawakar has asked, how can we accelerate growth of e-mobility in developing countries like India using experience from companies like Lyft?
So I think the good news about e-mobility, when we look at the electric aspect, and I'll talk about self-driving, is that it's a lower total cost of ownership overall because there's less parts in the drivetrain. The energy costs are lower than gasoline. So all those things I think are applied to developing countries like India as well. And India is even being more innovative around lowering the upfront cost and seeing vehicles that they can that manufacture at scale for $10,000 or so. So I'm confident that a lot of the benefits of e-mobility will be realized too. Now, self-driving vehicles is a little bit of a different story. Two things. One, the environment, if anyone's ever driven in India, and I have been in a car in India, and it's very challenging. So it's a different learning, not impossible, but it'll take some time. Two is that the cost of labor of driving is very low in India. So when you compare that to a premium you're paying for a self-driving vehicle and all the expensive computers, et cetera, that are on there, those curves aren't going to meet for some time after the developed world, but it will happen over time.
So we have a question, and I think it's particularly important with Paula's talk about equity, is that the cost to users can be difficult. So can you talk about sort of low income users, people in communities that may or may not have as much access to transportation now?
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely a critical point. And right now, we are spending a great deal of money, probably not enough, on moving around people in underserved communities with very inefficient means. So for example, a 60+ person bus that is full of maybe 3 people, or it operates on a schedule that's inconvenient to someone's job, which is their lifeblood in doing it. So the answer to it is a combination of increasing convenience and at the same time moving affordability. If we move to self-driving, especially on a single vehicle perspective, we're taking out over 50% of the costs of that transportation. So I do think the costs will be coming down, especially as these vehicles are at scale. And if we can move to smaller form factors and we can move to mobility that is seamless, where you can say, look, if you just took transit and then you walked, and then maybe you took a scooter, you can get the cost down significantly more than relying on other means and still be able to make that work appointment that's critical that's there. So I do believe this shift is going to be important. And it will impact both from the self-driving costs as well as looking at the cost-time trade-off that exists in mobility without owning the vehicle.
Okay. Another question, is Lyft's autonomy moving in the direction of video camera only or a combination of LiDAR and camera?
So our belief is that we have seen no evidence that you can do full autonomy, which we call level 4 autonomy, where there is no driver assistance, without the safety benefits of having multi-modes of sensing, which includes LiDAR, camera, radar, and even other sensors that are there. So the short answer is no. We believe that you need all, but certainly some bets are being made in the industry that say otherwise. So we'll see.
So a question occurs to me as well. I know there have been studies about transportation hubs like airports that have had, and I know we're talking about electric vehicles in the future, but we've talked, there's been an air quality issue around particular transportation hubs because we have extra vehicles in certain locations where they may not have been before. So is there an air quality connection or something that you all are thinking about working on?
I think it is a fair issue around the number of vehicles that are introduced in any sort of venue, whether it's an airport or something else, which will impact 2 things: congestion and, of course, air quality and emissions. They're aligned in doing it. And so we have been working on more efficient ways of getting just the right number of vehicles when they need to be there in an airport. LAX, for example, and other airports are starting to institute where you can just go with a code there versus having a Lyft driver that's waiting for you and waiting for someone else that's there in a parking lot, so that it's more on demand and just in time. So we think that it is going to be important working closely with airports, and there's a number of different innovations to make that process easier.
So can you tell us a little bit about those innovations? I'm very curious.
Well, one of them is going back. It's like almost back to school, back to the old world, which is that you just get a code and you match to the nearest driver that's there, versus pulling someone from 10 minutes away, having them drive in the airport, wait for 15 minutes and wait for the ride and go. So it's more of having a steady stable of cars, and also using our data to understand exactly how many vehicles do we need to be in the vicinity that are there. And of course, another piece of it is electrifying the fleet, which we're doing in parallel to all of that.
So can you talk a little bit about how universities can partner with an organization like yours? Like, what kind of research can university faculty do? And are you working with any universities currently?
So yes, we are. I think there's a couple of different elements. One is just the technological innovation required in drivetrains and sensing and automation. That's, places like Carnegie Mellon, lots of other universities we're taking advantage of a ton of innovation out of there. And really, it was a lot because of places like Carnegie Mellon that we're seeing this advancement in self-driving. So that, I think, is a given, which is the science. But there's another element, which is understanding the interplay of complex systems and understanding the full supply chain around providing transportation, and looking where energy is coming from, even if it's coming electric, where's the original source, and looking at how the nature of streets are being used in vehicle changes and emissions and air quality, all of those things that take into account societal factors that go beyond just our business. I think it's where universities can help in terms of the data and being able to understand that. And we've had some talks with several universities that are leading the way on trying to get to a more data-driven transportation as a service network.
Okay. So I have just one final question, which is around your vision of the future. I know you've talked to it, but what is your most important thing that you hope to see in 10 years? So
personally, I resonated a lot with the talks that Jim gave around we are not on the trajectory right now around emissions. And so the most important thing is the electrification of transportation and to go to zero emissions on it. And I'm excited that Lyft has taken the bold step of saying 2030, when frankly, not everyone, including us, have all the answers. Not everyone has a detailed roadmap, but you got to set down the goal, and we have to do it. There's just no other way.
Raj Kapoor, CMU alum and Lyft, thank you so much for spending some time with us this afternoon. I appreciate that you've been here all day with us, and so was listening in to our earlier conversation with Jim Skay. So thank you very much.